Picture the most ordinary moment in your life. You wake up before your alarm. The room is dark and quiet. Maybe rain is tapping against the window. You lie there, suspended between sleep and the day, and for a few minutes, nobody in the world knows exactly where you are or what you're thinking. It feels unremarkable. It feels like nothing. But that moment, that small, silent, completely private moment, is one of the most historically unusual experiences a human being can have. For the overwhelming majority of our existence on this planet, that feeling was physically impossible. Modern humans treat privacy the way they treat oxygen. They only notice it when it disappears. Lock someone in a shared room for a week with no personal space and watch what happens to their psychology. Studies on overcrowded prisons, military barracks, and refugee shelters consistently show the same result. The absence of privacy produces measurable anxiety, aggression, and emotional deterioration. We treat solitude as a fundamental human need, but here's what the archaeological record quietly suggests. That need, as we experience it today, may be almost entirely invented. To understand how ancient humans navigated a world without privacy, you first have to dismantle your assumptions about what being human even looked like. For roughly 95% of the time our species has existed, that's somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 years, we lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving across open landscapes in small, tightly bonded groups. Not hundreds of people, not even dozens. Typically between 15 and 50 individuals. A band, a family cluster, a moving unit of people who were related by blood, by partnership, by shared survival. And they were always together. Imagine waking up inside a temporary brush shelter on the edge of an African savanna, perhaps 80,000 years ago. The shelter itself is barely large enough for a family to lie side by side. It has no rooms, it has no door. It is made from branches, leaves, and animal skins arranged to block wind and rain. Around you, within a few feet, sleep the other members of your group. Children pressed against parents. Older relatives huddled together for warmth. Outside, a fire burns low, tended through the night because the darkness beyond its light belongs to predators. This is not a camp. This is your world. It has no edges you can disappear into. Archaeology has given us a remarkably detailed window into these early sleeping arrangements. At a site called Sabudu Cave in South Africa, researchers discovered beds made from layers of plant material dating back 77,000 years. These weren't luxurious sleeping quarters. They were compressed mats of sedge and rushes, some with insect-repelling leaves layered beneath. The beds were found clustered together in the cave's interior. There were no partitions between them, no symbolic boundaries separating one sleeping space from another. Everyone occupied the same continuous floor. Proximity wasn't a social choice. It was architecture. But here is where the story gets genuinely surprising. When anthropologists began living alongside modern hunter-gatherer communities in the 20th century, groups whose way of life offered the closest available window into prehistoric social behavior, they discovered something that challenged every modern assumption about human nature. These communities didn't appear to experience the absence of privacy as suffering. They weren't suppressing a frustrated longing for solitude. The desire itself seemed to operate differently. To understand why, you have to understand what the self meant in a world without walls. In individualistic modern societies, identity is constructed inward. You are what you think, what you feel privately, what you choose independently. Your inner world is understood as the real you. But in communal societies held together by mutual survival, identity is constructed outward. You are your role. You are your relationship to others. You are what you contribute to the group. The boundaries of the self are porous because the boundaries of survival are porous. Your fire is everyone's fire. Your hunger is everyone's hunger. And when the self is built this way, the idea of needing to escape that self, to step away from the group and simply be alone, doesn't carry the same psychological weight. It barely registers as a need at all. The anthropologist Colin Turnbull documented this with extraordinary precision during his years living alongside the Mbuti of the Ituri forest in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. He found that the Mbuti possessed no concept in their language that cleanly mapped onto the English word privacy. Not because their language was limited. Turnbull was emphatic on this point. Their language was sophisticated, expressive, and nuanced. The concept simply hadn't required a word because the experience it described, the desire to be physically and psychologically sealed off from others, was genuinely foreign to how they understood life. Solitude, when it occurred, was not restorative, it was disorienting. This wasn't unique to the Mabudi. Researchers studying the Hadza of Tanzania, the Kumsan of the Kalahari, and Aboriginal Australian communities observed similar patterns. These were not people who were simply tolerating closeness. They were people for whom closeness was the natural state, for whom the presence of others was not an intrusion, but a foundation. The discomfort that modern humans feel in a crowded room, they felt in an empty one. The question wasn't how ancient humans coped with no privacy. The deeper question was whether they needed it in the way we assume all humans must. And yet, and this is crucial, they weren't without boundaries. They simply enforced them differently. Across every hunter-gatherer culture that anthropologists have studied, a consistent set of behavioral codes emerged. Not laws, not written rules, but shared, unspoken agreements about how to give one another invisible space within the physical closeness of communal life. These codes were so universal that researchers began recognizing them as something deeply embedded in human social behavior. Not the need for physical privacy, but something older, the need for acknowledged boundaries. The enforcement mechanism wasn't a wall, it was collective pretense. The first of these codes operated through time. Darkness was ancient humanity's most reliable boundary. At night, when firelight faded to embers and the group settled into sleep, social perception contracted. What you could not clearly see, social protocol required you to be unaware of. Ethnographic research among contemporary hunter-gatherer groups consistently documents this. Couples who needed intimate time waited for the cover of dark and the sound of steady breathing from sleeping companions. The darkness wasn't just physical, it was a shared social signal. When the camp grew quiet, the unspoken agreement was that perception itself went quiet with it. The second code operated through space. Small distances, navigated with careful social intention, became enormous. A couple walking 50 feet from the edge of camp in darkness were, by the social rules of their group, effectively invisible. Not hidden from sight, in flat, open terrain, movement was visible, but hidden from social acknowledgement. The group did not track them, did not comment when they returned, did not register the absence in any way that would be spoken of. 50 feet in the ancient world, wrapped in shared willful ignorance, could function as a private room. The distance wasn't measured in feet, it was measured in the agreement not to look. The third code was the most sophisticated and arguably the most enduring. Every human society, from hunter-gatherer bands to 21st century office buildings, operates on some version of what sociologists call civil inattention. The deliberate, practiced act of not noticing what you have clearly noticed. In the ancient camp, this was not politeness, it was survival technology. A group that constantly monitored, acknowledged, and commented on every intimate behavior of its members would rapidly fracture under the social tension. Civil inattention was the glue that held communal life together. It created psychological privacy inside physical closeness, and traces of it are everywhere in modern life, in the careful non-eye contact of elevator rides, in the studied indifference of public transport, in the mutual pretense of gym locker rooms. Now consider the question that everyone, without exception, wonders about but rarely asks directly: biological necessity. The functions of the body that can't be timed, can't always be quietly concealed in darkness, and were, for hundreds of thousands of years, handled without any infrastructure whatsoever. The archaeological evidence here is illuminating in a way that feels almost counterintuitive. Studies of hunter-gatherer latrine behavior, yes, this is a field of genuine academic inquiry, suggest that ancient camps maintained designated elimination zones, typically downwind and at a specific distance from sleeping and food preparation areas. This wasn't accidental. It was organized. It reveals something important. Ancient humans weren't randomly or carelessly communal. They maintained structured spatial systems even without architecture. And the behavioral code applied here too. You walked to the perimeter. You were followed by no one. You returned without announcement or acknowledgement. The group's attention collectively failed to notice. There's a striking parallel with modern public restrooms, which are simultaneously one of the most intimate and most socially codified spaces in contemporary life. Strangers share a room for deeply private biological functions and maintain the collective fiction that the other people present do not exist. The mechanics are different. The social technology is identical. Humans have been performing this particular act of shared ignoring for at least 250,000 years. But what about pain? Grief, emotional privacy, the internal world that modern humans guard so carefully, the thoughts we don't speak, the fears we don't share, the vulnerability we manage precisely because we can withdraw and process it alone. This is perhaps the most profound gap between ancient and modern psychological experience. In a group of 20 people with no physical separation and continuous proximity, emotional states were not private. They were communal weather. Your fear rippled through the camp. Your grief was witnessed in real time. Your anger had nowhere to go except into the open air of shared space. Research on modern grief in communal cultures reveals something remarkable. In many traditional societies, the absence of private emotional processing doesn't produce more suffering. It produces less. Communal grief rituals, where sorrow is witnessed, named, and held collectively, appear to move through communities more quickly and leave less lasting psychological damage than the privatized grief typical of modern individualistic societies. The contemporary epidemic of complicated grief and prolonged mourning may be, at least in part, a product of grieving alone. Ancient humans didn't have the option to process loss in solitude, and it's entirely possible that this was not a disadvantage. Then came one of the most consequential transitions in human history. Around 12,000 years ago, in the fertile river valleys of the Middle East, the region archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, something began to change. People started staying in one place. Not because they were tired of moving, but because the land was yielding enough food to make movement unnecessary. Wild grasses with heavy seeds, herds of animals docile enough to be kept rather than hunted. For the first time, permanent settlement became not just possible, but logical. And permanent settlement required permanent structures. And permanent structures, for the first time in human history, could have walls. The earliest Neolithic settlements, excavated at sites like Ain Ghazal in Jordan and Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey, reveal something fascinating about how humans used this new architectural capability. At Çatalhöyük, a settlement occupied continuously from approximately 7,500 to 5,700 BCE, houses were built directly against one another with no streets between them. Entrance was through holes in the roofs. Every home shared walls with its neighbors. Privacy, in the sense of visual and acoustic separation from the community, was still minimal. But something had changed. There were now interior spaces, rooms with defined boundaries, places where the social gaze of the group stopped at a physical threshold. The door had not yet been invented, but the wall had. What archaeology reveals about these early interior spaces is that they were immediately assigned social meaning. Different areas of the single-room Neolithic home were designated for sleeping, food preparation, storage, and ritual. The sleeping platforms at Çatalhöyük were elevated, literally raised above the activity floor, creating a distinction between the space of rest and the space of daily life. Burial sites were found beneath these sleeping platforms, suggesting that the boundary between the living and the dead was managed within the same domestic interior. These early humans weren't just building shelter, they were designing social space, deciding for the first time that some activities belonged in some places and not others. Ancient Mesopotamia took this spatial organization considerably further. By 3000 BCE, Sumerian cities like Ur and Uruk contained houses with multiple rooms, interior courtyards, and designated private quarters. Cuneiform tablets from the period reveal legal codes governing household boundaries, laws about when a neighbor could enter another's home, about noise, about the visibility of domestic spaces from the street. The Mesopotamians were not just building rooms, they were constructing a legal architecture of personal space. Writing down, for the first time, that where the public world ended and the private world began was a matter important enough to regulate. In ancient Egypt, tomb paintings and household papyri give us an unusually detailed picture of domestic life among the non-royal population. Middle Kingdom homes dating from around 2000 BCE show multiple rooms with specific functions. Sleeping areas were separated from reception rooms. Kitchens were placed at the rear of dwellings, away from the street-facing facade. Wealthy homes contained rooms identifiable as private quarters accessible only to family members. Yet even in these relatively sophisticated domestic arrangements, the modern concept of personal privacy as a right belonging to each individual regardless of class or status was entirely absent. Privacy was a privilege. Its availability scaled precisely with wealth and social rank. The poor slept communally. The powerful slept alone. Ancient Greece introduced something genuinely new to the history of privacy, not just the physical reality of private space, but a philosophical framework for thinking about it. The Greeks divided human life into two distinct domains, the oikos and the polis. The polis was the public world, the marketplace, the assembly, the spaces of civic life where a citizen performed his role in the collective. The oikos was the private household, the domain of family, domestic economy, and personal life shielded from public view. For the first time in recorded history, the boundary between these two worlds was understood not merely as a physical fact, but as a moral and social principle. Some things belonged to the community, some things belonged only to you. But it would be a mistake to romanticize Greek privacy as something resembling our modern experience. The oikos was not a sanctuary of individual freedom. It was a hierarchy. The male head of household held authority over everyone within those walls. Wife, children, slaves. Privacy within the Greek home was stratified by power. Women lived in designated sections of the house, the gynaikonitis, physically separated from the male-dominated public rooms. Slaves had no private space whatsoever. The philosophical achievement of the Greeks was recognizing that private space existed as a category. The distribution of that space remained radically unequal. Rome expanded this architecture of privacy on a scale the ancient world had never seen, and then almost immediately complicated it. Roman cities were dense, vertical, and acoustically porous in ways that made genuine privacy nearly impossible for most residents. The majority of Rome's population lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that housed dozens of families in adjacent rooms separated by thin walls. Noise traveled freely, smells traveled freely. Arguments, celebrations, and intimate moments were shared involuntarily with every neighbor on the floor. Wealthy Romans, by contrast, occupied sprawling townhouses with private gardens, rooms for every function, and slaves whose entire purpose was to manage access to their master's personal space. Privacy in Rome wasn't a right. It was a commodity purchased with wealth. And yet, Roman public life contains something extraordinary that defies modern intuitions entirely. The great bathhouses, the thermae, were simultaneously the most public and the most physically intimate spaces in the ancient world. At the baths of Caracalla, completed in 216 CE, over 1,600 people could bathe simultaneously in shared pools, completely unclothed, across rooms of staggering architectural grandeur. Romans of every class, senators, merchants, craftsmen, sat beside one another in the hot rooms, the warm rooms, the cold plunge pools. Business was conducted, political alliances were formed, philosophy was debated. All of it in a state of complete physical exposure. The Romans did not experience this as a violation of privacy. They experienced it as civilization. Alongside the bathhouses, Roman cities featured another institution that challenges modern sensibilities entirely: the communal latrine, or forica. In the forica of Ostia Antica, Rome's ancient port city, marble seats were arranged in a continuous U-shape around a central channel of flowing water. No partitions, no visual barriers. Citizens sat side by side and conducted private business in complete public view while simultaneously conducting public conversation. Archaeological evidence suggests the forica were social spaces, places where Romans gathered, talked, read, and maintained relationships. The complete absence of what we would consider basic bathroom privacy was not a hardship to be endured. It was a social experience to be enjoyed. The Romans had developed the same civil inattention that their prehistoric ancestors used around a campfire, simply formalized, marbled, and fitted with underfloor heating. Medieval Europe presents perhaps the most jarring contrast with modern expectations, not because it was primitive, but because it was architecturally sophisticated in ways that still produced almost total communal living. Even in stone castles, the most structurally impressive buildings of the medieval world, interior life was relentlessly communal. The Great Hall was the center of everything: eating, entertainment, sleeping for most of the household. Knights and servants spread their bedrolls across the same floor each night. The lord and lady might occupy a separate chamber, but that chamber was regularly accessed by attendants, advisors, and visitors at any hour. Medieval sources describe the bedroom not as a private retreat, but as a semi-public audience chamber. Kings received ambassadors in their bedchambers while dressing. The most intimate space in the building was, paradoxically, one of the most trafficked. For common people across medieval Europe, the single-room dwelling was not an exception, but the standard. Families of 6, 8, 10 people occupied one room that served as kitchen, bedroom, workshop, and shelter for domestic animals in cold months. Historian Philippe Ariès, in his groundbreaking work on the history of childhood, documented that the medieval mind did not draw a strong distinction between public and private life, because the architectural conditions for such a distinction simply didn't exist for most people. Children witnessed the full range of adult life, its intimacy, its violence, its bodily functions, its death, not because medieval parents were careless, but because there was nowhere else for children to be. The history of sleep itself contains a discovery so startling that it reframes everything we think we know about the most private hours of human existence. Historian A. Roger E. Kirch spent 16 years researching pre-industrial sleep patterns and published his findings in his 2005 book At Day's Close: Night in Times Past. His research across hundreds of historical documents, court records, diaries, medical texts, literature, revealed that before artificial lighting became widespread, humans across virtually every culture did not sleep in a single continuous block the way we do today. They slept in two distinct phases, separated by an hour or more of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. This waking period, documented so consistently that it had its own vocabulary across multiple languages, was used for prayer, for conversation, for visiting neighbors, for reflection, and for intimacy. The night was not a sealed chamber of unconsciousness. It was its own social space. The Industrial Revolution shattered this ancient rhythm. Artificial lighting extended the productive day deep into what had previously been the territory of darkness. Factory schedules demanded consolidated sleep. The two-phase pattern, which had structured human nights for tens of thousands of years, was compressed into the single 8-hour block that modern medicine now presents as the biological norm. What we experience as normal sleep is, in the deepest historical sense, profoundly abnormal. A creature of industrialization, not of human nature. And with the loss of that middle-of-the-night wakefulness went one of the last remaining communal rituals of the dark. The quiet hour when neighbors visited and families talked, and the boundary between sleeping and waking was, briefly, a shared experience rather than a private one. The 18th century brought what historians of domestic life describe as a revolution in spatial privacy. Not a gradual evolution, but a relatively sudden reorganization of how interior space was conceived and built. In prosperous European homes, corridors began appearing for the first time. Before the corridor, moving through a house meant passing through every room in sequence. Every interior journey was a social one. The corridor changed this completely. Suddenly, rooms could be accessed independently. You could move from one part of the house to another without passing through spaces occupied by other people. The door, which had existed for centuries as a structural element, became for the first time a genuine privacy technology, a mechanism for controlling access to a specific interior world. Child psychology as a discipline emerged in the late 19th century and almost immediately began arguing for what would become one of the most transformative architectural changes in the history of domestic life: the child's separate bedroom. Before roughly 1900, even in wealthy households, children shared sleeping spaces, with siblings, with servants, sometimes with parents. The idea that a child required and deserved their own enclosed, private sleeping space was a genuinely radical proposition. It implied that the developing self needed shelter from observation, that psychological growth required intervals of unsupervised interiority, that personhood itself was something cultivated in private. Within a few decades, the separate children's bedroom shifted from luxury to expectation to requirement, at least in the industrialized West, and childhood itself was permanently restructured around the assumption of personal space. By the mid-20th century, the transformation was essentially complete, at least in wealthy societies. The single-family home with individual bedrooms had become the architectural standard against which all other living arrangements were measured, and frequently found lacking. Privacy was no longer a privilege or a philosophical principle. It had become a right, a medical recommendation, a psychological necessity, and a real estate category. Zoning laws protected it, building codes mandated it, therapists prescribed it, and quietly, underneath all of this institutional endorsement, something else was happening. Something the archaeological record of 300,000 years of human history might have predicted if anyone had been paying attention. The loneliness epidemic, documented now across dozens of countries and described by researchers as a public health crisis of the first order, emerged in almost direct proportion to the privatization of domestic life. The United States Surgeon General's 2023 advisory on loneliness cited research showing that approximately half of American adults report measurable feelings of loneliness. In the United Kingdom, a government minister for loneliness was appointed in 2018 in response to research suggesting that over 9 million people, nearly 1 in 7, regularly felt lonely. These are not numbers from populations living in physical isolation. They are numbers from populations with unprecedented access to private space, personal technology, and individual comfort. They are numbers from populations that have successfully built the world ancient humans never had, and discovered that it is missing something ancient humans always possessed. What exactly is missing sits at the intersection of neuroscience, anthropology, and evolutionary biology. Research on social bonding in primates, our closest biological relatives, consistently shows that physical proximity, shared space, and collective presence activate specific neurological reward pathways associated with safety, belonging, and identity. The grooming behavior of chimpanzees and bonobos, which occupies enormous portions of their social time, is not primarily about hygiene. It is a neurological maintenance system. It is the physical expression of the bond that makes survival possible. Human equivalents of this behavior, the casual shared presence of people occupying the same space without specific purpose, simply being together, have been progressively displaced by private space, private screens, and private schedules. We have optimized away the idle togetherness that for hundreds of thousands of years was the foundation of human psychological health. There is a concept in Japanese urban design called ma, a word that translates imperfectly as negative space or meaningful emptiness, but which in its architectural application refers to the intentional quality of space between things. Japanese domestic design has historically maintained a more permeable relationship between interior spaces than Western architecture. Rooms defined by sliding screens rather than fixed walls, thresholds that suggest rather than enforce separation. This isn't coincidental. It reflects a cultural inheritance that never fully severed the connection between privacy as an individual good and community as a collective necessity. The walls are there, but they can be moved. Stand in any major city today and count the walls. The ones between apartments, between offices, between houses, between the seat you're in and the seat next to you on public transport. Count the screens, the phones held up like portable walls, the headphones that build acoustic chambers around individual heads in shared spaces. We have become extraordinarily skilled at building enclosures, at defending the perimeter of the private self, at ensuring that, in a world of 8 billion people, we move through most of our lives effectively alone. The ancient camp is gone. The brush shelter is gone. The pile of sleeping bodies around the dying fire, the shared darkness, the collective pretense of not noticing, all gone. We replaced them with everything we thought we wanted. Rooms with doors, beds with only 2 people, mornings when no one knows exactly where you are or what you're thinking. We built a world optimized for the individual, only to discover that the individual, cut loose from the constant, unavoidable, sometimes maddening presence of others, is surprisingly fragile, surprisingly incomplete, surprisingly lonely. Perhaps the deepest insight buried in the archaeology of ancient privacy is not about ancient humans at all. It is about what we reveal when we study them. We went looking for how they coped with closeness. We found instead that closeness was not the problem they were solving. The problem they were solving was survival, and the tool they used, almost universally, across every culture and every continent, was each other. The wall came later. The loneliness came with it. And somewhere in the distance between those two facts lies a question that no amount of private space has yet helped us answer. What is a self when there is no one else in the room?